Well, hello there, Space Monkeys. Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. We're going to be reading Dreamland again today by Quinones. It's a little bit of a longer chapter. It's called All About the 501s, starting on page 100. And I will continue doing my book club on my YouTube channel, but in case you guys missed it, all of my political content for Season 3 is going to be Rockfin and Rumble, so if you want to see anything other than the book club, that's where you're going to find me. I'm taking a little break right now, but we will continue the book club continuously. So let's continue here, page 100. All About the 501s. Boise, Idaho. From what Ed Rupplinger could tell, there was nothing dumb about Poya. Poya was a Mexican in his mid-40s. He was about 5 feet 9 and the type of guy who could have easily grown heavy had he not gone to the gym, which he did a lot. Poya was trim, conservative, respectable, and looked to the world like a small businessman. He had a wife back in Mexico who nagged him about doing the books, about making sure the flow of inventory was reliable, and that his salesmen weren't abusing their expense accounts out in the field. Poya's real name was Cesar Garcia Langarica. He was in the black tar heroin business, and he was from Jalisco Nayarit on Mexico's Pacific coast. It was 1995, and Ed Rupplinger was a narcotics investigator with a drug task force in Boise, Idaho. Poya's younger workers were both the source of his profits and the bane of his existence. Motivating them while he was out of town took most of his working hours. He did this without threat or coercion and handled their misadventures with patience, it seemed to Rupplinger. When one of them crashed into a sign outside the complex where Poya had rented them an apartment, he appeared at the manager's office the next day with money to pay for the damage. Rupplinger heard this story from the apartment complex manager. Through the 90s, the Jalisco system had refined through trial and error. The boys compared notes at barbecues back in Jalisco, and slowly a set of rules evolved that was passed along like folklore. One rule: no violence. At the time, the best-known drug gangs, the Bloods and the Crips, shot it out over crack cocaine on street corners in towns far from LA, garnering police attention wherever they went. Watching all this, the Jalisco boys quietly began to expand nationwide by doing exactly the opposite. Poya was part of that 1990s expansion, and one place he showed up was Boise. Rupplinger's interest was first piqued when the drug unit suddenly began arresting Mexican drivers tooling around town selling heroin in balloons that they kept in their mouths. They were easy to spot and bust, particularly with the help of addicts who, once arrested, were terrified of withdrawing in jail. As Dennis Chavez had seen in Denver, and as the drug agents elsewhere would later discover, Rupplinger noticed that these Mexican drivers often had only a small amount of heroin and no weapons, so they never did much jail time. But it struck Rupplinger's best police nerve that whenever he could determine where they were from, it turned out they were from a state in Mexico called Nayarit. What's more, these guys were replaced within a couple of days. After a while, Rupplinger realized it didn't matter how many Nayarit heroin drivers his task force arrested. More drivers filled the open slots. Anybody could have taken the case, but Ed Rupplinger alone set about trying to answer the questions that arose as the Ada Metro Narcotics Task Force arrested more and more of these drivers. Who was behind them, he wondered. It was way too organized. This could not be unique to Boise, which was no one's natural choice of a place to start up a drug-dealing enterprise. It had to have started somewhere else. Rupplinger had been puzzling this out for a few weeks and not getting very far when he first noticed Garcia Langarica's name. It surfaced on the apartment records of these drivers, or the cars that they drove. One day, Rupplinger watched a driver swing by an apartment building and pass a trim fellow some money. Here, clearly, was the boss, Rupplinger thought. Yet the first time Rupplinger and his colleagues followed Poya, the suspected ringleader walked into a Mexican restaurant and took his place as a cook behind the grill. The man Rupplinger took for a heroin kingpin appeared instead to be a simple cook and not worth the unit's time. But Rupplinger's hunch proved correct. A month later, Garcia Langarica quit the job. From then on, when Poya was in town, he spent all his time supervising his heroin drivers. Poya's drivers had been operating for a while and seemed to have Boise to themselves. Then a sharp-eyed postal inspector, just before Christmas in 1996, came upon a package that alerted a drug-sniffing dog. Inside was a Santa Claus doll, and inside the doll was black tar heroin. The local narcotics task force, which included Rupplinger, had the parcel delivered to the apartment it was addressed to. A Boise drug team burst in and found 4 well-dressed, middle-aged Mexican men sitting around a card table already breaking up the heroin into small packets. They, too, were all from the state of Nayarit, last name of Tejeda. The Santa Claus bust actually marked the beginning of the end for Poya's dominion over Boise. Rupplinger figured that word of Boise spread among the Nayarit heroin traffickers, and the crew after crew descended into the town to compete with Poya in what he had set up in Idaho's capital. One of Poya's former drivers ran a new cell, Rupplinger was amazed to note. He had gone back to Mexico, then returned to Boise with his own drivers, a dispatcher, and a supply source to compete head-to-head with his former boss. Poya was one of the founding fathers. He comes in and sets it all up, Rupplinger said when we met in Boise. The word gets out back home, then every operative in Nayarit ends up moving in. Much later, as I continued to piece through the story of the Jalisco boys, I met a woman who said she was married to one of the drivers who worked for Poya back in the mid-90s. Poya, she said, started in the San Fernando Valley, but competition pushed him to move his cells to Pomona in Ontario, 40 miles east of LA. His drivers often hung out at her mother's restaurant in Pomona, she said. There she met one of Poya's drivers, married him, and had children with him. They visited Jalisco twice. When we met, she told me that her now ex-husband had helped start a cell for Poya in Salt Lake City in the 90s, then broke off and began competing with him. Her brother-in-law helped open Boise for Poya, and then also started his own cell there in competition with his ex-boss. At the time, the cities had only small populations of heroin addicts, people scrounging every day to get their fix. A stagnant market left only one place to get customers. We were just poaching from Poya, she said. We would make the balloons bigger and attract us customers. Then we'd give specials, $600 instead of just $5. It was back and forth competition. Don't go with them, we can give you a better deal. But as we talked, what she told me about her ex and his family intrigued me even more. He came from a family that had land and farm animals. They grew sugarcane and made cheese. They were middle class by the standards of Mexican farm communities, she said. I expected most of these traffickers had come from the dirt poorest of families. That was true of the drivers, particularly those who came later, she said. But most of the heroin pioneers of Jalisco County were the sons of farmers who were pretty well off, again by Mexican agricultural standards. They had some money to invest. With resources also came broader horizons of what was possible and what they wanted or expected from life. Selling heroin was just easier than growing sugarcane. It was more adventurous, and it involved more cash. It gave them the means to build better houses, and this set off a construction boom across Jalisco County that employed dozens, if not hundreds, of construction workers by the end of the 90s. The houses went up in a few months, not a few years. No house in downtown Jalisco had rebar extending from the top of it. That was the difference between Jalisco and every other Mexican immigrant town. Jalisco had notably less rebar. Then she said something strange. After building their houses and providing for their families, what the guys she knew from Jalisco, Nayarit, seemed to want most of all were Levi's 501s. Levi's 501s were the pants-wear gold standard for men in Mexico's ranchos in the 90s. They were very expensive in Mexico. One thing that made the Jalisco Boys retail system so popular and young men eager to work in it was that the system provided a way to accumulate quantities, large stacks, of 501s very cheaply. That was because U.S. junkies soon learned these dealers' tastes and offered endless supplies of shoplifted 501s in exchange for their daily dope. Before long, the junkies took orders according to size and color and traded them 2 for 1, 2 pairs of 501s for one $20 balloon of black tar. When she was married in the Jalisco world, quote, it was more about jeans than anything, she told me. From day one, any opportunity to barter for jeans, they'd take it. They had stacks of jeans. They'd bring back home exactly the sizes that people wanted. This thirst for Levi's 501s, she said, is part of what propelled the Jalisco system as it began to expand out of the San Fernando Valley and through the western United States in the mid-90s. Back in the ranchos, nothing said that a man had moved up in the world like walking around in public in dark blue 501s. Seeing others in brand new Levi's 501s, meanwhile, inspired many youngsters who had only thin, cheap jeans, if they had any at all, to hire on as drivers. The more I asked about Levi's 501s as fuel for the expansion of the Jalisco heroin networks, the more people had to say about it. I once brought home 50 pairs of Levi's in suitcases, which I took with me coming down from the bus from California, said one Jalisco trafficker who worked crews in the San Fernando Valley and Columbus, and eventually was made manager of a crew in Denver as well. Quote, "I get them from clients who'd steal them from Sears. Many dealers like me were bringing back big quantities of Levi's. I'd give them away to my friends and family, but then after a while they started demanding them. Send me this, send me that. Then they wanted shirts, tennis shoes, they wanted everything." Levi's 501s were in fact part of a larger Keep Up with the Joneses competition that heroin revenue fueled back in the small town. Very quickly the families got caught up in this. Around town the gossip would start weeks in advance. So-and-so's coming home with gifts, and then we're going to kill a cow and he's going to pay for the banda. Every trafficker's return was like a Christmas day, as relatives lined up for gifts, especially those jeans. Some traffickers came pulling trailers full of clothes. The family wants more and more and more, so the guys start feeling the pressure, the ex-wife I interviewed told me. Gimme, gimme. You need to provide for me. Their own family starts thinking they deserve this. My ex-sister was demanding, you need to give me this, or you need to give me that. Whatever's yours is mine. My ex used to send all kinds of clothes home. First it was 501s, but then later it was, I want Guess jeans, then Tommy Hilfigers. Just as an addict couldn't choose not to use dope, these men couldn't not return to sell it. Up north, they slept on the floors of apartments, unwilling to invest even in a mattress, awaiting the day when they could go home bearing gifts. Once back in Jalisco, she said, they walked the town the object of other men's envy, paying for the banda and the beer, and surrounded by women. And no driver ever wanted to miss the Feria del Elote in August. That's when you get to show off the most, she said. It's like a kid going to Disneyland for the first time. They walk around with their chest out, and everybody looks at them. I imagined their moo receptors jolted in endorphins. They live for it. They save their frickin' pennies for it, she said. It's a euphoria. They get high on it. They're in a fantasy land, in a dream, where they think they're the kings until the money runs out. Thus, with an addict's energy and single-mindedness, she said, the Jalisco boys sought new markets with higher profit margins, awaiting the chance to go back home, the kings of their dreamland, for a week or two. Only the self-centeredness of addiction, she said, explained how farm boys from a traditional and conservative small town could sell a product, anathema to their parents, to sad-eyed, vulnerable junkies, and not be tormented. I used to work in a laboratory where they did research on animals and have to kill them, the ex-wife said. The way you deal with that is you disassociate yourself from the animal. You don't let it get to you. You put up that barrier, and that's what they do. But they do that with people. Ed Rupplinger struggled to keep up as more crews started up in Boise. He created timelines and flowcharts of connections between Poya and drivers in other U.S. cities. Others in the unit thought he was crazy. When had Boise figured into any kind of international narcotics conspiracy? Plus, so many Hispanic names wearied the mind. Rupplinger got permission to run wiretaps on Poya's phones. The extent of Poya's business then grew clearer. He had crews in Portland, too, and in Salt Lake City and Honolulu. Salt Lake did more business than Boise. Rupplinger heard Poya complain that he left Denver because it got so he couldn't make any money there with crews from his hometown competing for the same addicts. New cells took his clients, and to win them back he had to lower his prices. Rupplinger marveled at how massive and connected the Jalisco network was. Poya's heroin store practiced just-in-time supply, with women as mules every couple of weeks bringing up a pound of heroin at a time. Keen to keep competitors at bay, Poya insisted that his drivers provide excellent customer service. Once, when a driver reported a customer complaint of a bad batch, Poya promised to make it right. The driver delivered better quality stuff to the client the next day. When Rupplinger heard that, he felt he was watching the expansion of some new scary thing, as if he were all alone in a lab where a virus had escaped its test tube. One day, Rupplinger heard one of the drivers tell Poya that he was afraid of delivering to the nearby town of Caldwell because the gangs there scared him. Poya told him he'd handle it. The conversation stayed with Rupplinger, who had worked in Southern California and knew that the gangs in tiny Caldwell were but faint echoes of gangs elsewhere. What kind of drug crew was this that was scared of wannabe gangs of Caldwell, Idaho? Every narcotics agent in the 90s had the Bloods and the Crips crack warfare as precedent, and the Colombian cocaine cowboys in Miami before that. The Nayarit's weren't that way. With faith in their addictive product, they didn't need to shoot it out for territory. These drivers knew each other and would stop and chat or meet for lunch. Even as they competed and drove down each other's prices, they did so in peace. They went out of their way to avoid attention. It helped that the drivers had no investment in how much they sold and that they didn't use. There was no incentive for them to cut their dope. They didn't make any more money if they cut it than if they sold it as it came. They were employees, guys on a salary, with their costs covered and a stipend of several $100s a week. The last thing they wanted was violence. In 2 years, from 95 to 97, Boise's minor market and a half-dozen crews selling heroin like pizza. But that wasn't all. From the wiretaps, Rupplinger heard Poya call Phoenix, Ontario, El Monte, Salt Lake, Portland, Billings, Las Vegas, Honolulu. If Boise had a half-dozen, how many crews must Denver have? What about Portland or Las Vegas? The heroin cells were like ants in a garden. You didn't see them unless you got close enough to know what to look for. Then, even then, when you stamped them out, more came back to take their place. It was 1997, well before most other cops in the country. Ed Rupplinger was figuring out how to see the ants. So we'll continue with the next chapter. It's called The Landmark Study on page 107 with the next episode. Probably be out tomorrow or the next day. Keep fighting that good fight, guys. Talk to you later.